No, this book was, I mean, it's brilliant. It's unique in the environment, I think. So that's from my
Yes, it's the first one in the DA.
Yes, well, yeah. But it's the most interesting one. Why do you, and you mention in your book the way DA supporters are sometimes very quiet when you say something about the ANC, they you're right, and this I know from comedy very clearly. When you criticize the DA or something happens DA-wise, they just go very quiet, tweeting and answering. But why is that? Why are they so reactive to critique?
Well, I don't think they're unique in that respect. I mean, I think all party supporters are like that. So I don't think there's anything interesting worth observing in that respect, other than perhaps to say that I think some DA supporters would like to believe that they're different kinds of animal compared to ANC supporters, which is not true. And as the party grows, it is increasingly unlikely and unrealistic to expect the party supporters to be different to the supporters of, say, the ANC, because if you're going to grow, you will necessarily look more like a genuine demographic representative of the entire country. And the country is made of a range of people, bigots, people who don't like debating, people who are tone deaf, some people who are empathetic, some are liberal, some are conservative. It's impossible for the DA to grow its support base, but to grow it with only one kind of supporter. And so you're going to find on Twitter people who are resistant to debate, people who are trolls on Twitter, and then you'll find some people who are happy to engage, and there are many of those as well. I have some really fascinating and great conversations with many DA politicians, MP supporters, and then I have the ones that I just regard as completely recalcitrant. So they're no different to the ANC. Where there is a difference is, I have to confess, it's just my anecdotal experience. I've met more DA supporters who would like to believe that they're fundamentally different to an ANC supporter.
Cool.
And they're not.
About this tone-deaf cultural sensitivity thing, obviously that's the story of South Africa in many ways. In what way is the DA's cultural sensitivity working? What are they getting right as far as cultural sensitivity? It's something sort of was, I got bits from the book, but I'm trying to sort of understand your overall picture of that.
They're getting very little right. I spent an entire chapter, I think it's entitled, Please Don't Stop Shouting at Me. And it's about the tone deafness of the DA. And it's interesting because one of the things which Louise Grantham, one of my publishers and I, the English publisher, debated when I conceptualized the book and I proposed it to her was how much of the book should be about policy. And in the end, there's only one policy that I discuss, and that's very deliberate. Because I said to her, I'm not trying to write a book as an analyst. I want the DA to get a sense of what I talk about when I'm having dinner, when I'm at a braai, and if I'm having a drink late at night, as I will later on Long Street, so that they can get a sense of how I think as a voter, not how I think as Eusebius, an analyst, a commentator, or talk show host. And the reality is that actually the vast majority of policies are not going to determine what I will do on the 7th of May. There's only one policy that is a deal breaker for me, and it happens to be BEE. So that's the one policy I do discuss. So there are many other things in the book that, for better or worse, are deal breakers for me as Eusebius McKaiser. So it's an extremely subjective book in that sense, and I'm fine with that. But one of them, Conrad, is tonality. You know, when we come from a history in this country where our parents were shouted at as black people, there's nothing that's more bloody irritating than anything that takes you back to a space of being shouted at. So anything that's shrill in communication, political communication, turns me off as a voter. And when you are faced with Nkantlagate versus Diane Kohler Barnard being shrill on radio, that's actually a hard choice for me. You might think, oh my God, it's a no-brainer. The opportunity cost of more than 200 million rand is so gigantic that obviously you're not going to vote for the person that is responsible for the opportunity cost of 200 million. That's irrational. You don't know what it does to me emotionally to hear someone who sounds like the white woman who shouted at my aunt when she was at a char in Cape Town. You don't know that. So the DA makes stupid mistakes. We're not even talking policy now, we're talking about communication and tone. So tonality is something that matters to me. But here's the good news, and this is why I'm saying people must read the bloody book instead of just going with one review. I have plenty of examples of when the DA get it, examples of people who get it right in the DA. Musi gets it right a lot. I mean, his tone is beautiful. I think he's in overdrive. The young person in charge of his comms should be fired. This Obama thing is just cheesy. When he is himself, he's actually good enough. I mean, he's trained, he's a pastor, he's got a background in theology. The Musi I first met when he started out in politics, his natural self is okay, but this deliberate attempt to be the whole Obama belief thing doesn't work. Just be your natural self. When he's on TV, he smiles. If you mute TV and you watch his body language, it's beautiful. And more people in the DA, including Lindewehr, should mimic and learn from him. The other example I gave that's a positive example, which is why it's wrong to think the book is a one-sided hatchet job of the DA, is Ian Ollis, who once told a beautiful story at Wits at a debate about how he once dated, he had a black partner that he was dating at the time, and they were talking about politics, and his black partner said to him, "I could never vote for you, Ian." And Ian said to the audience, you know, he was more gentle than me in his tone, and he told the story over several minutes and ended the story by basically saying, my wish for this country is to live in a country where my partner is happy not just to date me, to be my boyfriend or my husband, but also to vote for me as a political leader. Now the lesson was very simple. He personalized politics. He made himself vulnerable. He used the storytelling technique. He drew the audience in. He captured their attention the way you guys are listening now. He wasn't bloody shouting at me or showing me a slide with stats about how amazing Cape Town is. He understood the art of communicating as a human being. That stuff makes me think, oh God, this is a white guy that I want to be in charge of my suburb. I don't care that he's white. This is a human being. That is tonality that speaks to me as a black person that understands me. And I want to be part of that guy's political party. That's what I mean by tone. We're not even talking about data. We're not talking about political ideology. We're not talking about liberalism. We're just hitting the pause button on tone and communications. And it's what's most bizarre about it, Conrad, is that this is a low-hanging fruit. It really doesn't take a genius to change communications.
I fully agree. Just as a little anecdote there, I've interviewed both Ian and Musi twice, both of them. And Musi handles, Musi brilliant, but Lindiwe won't do an interview. She's so open-minded, but she won't do the interview. Versus Helen would, and Blaine Zimande would, I mean, you know. If Blaine Zimande is fine, then really, come on. Two questions there. You see, the DA's got a problem that it needs to deal with effectively white privilege, being an example of dealing with that. But it has to deal effectively with the white privilege of its largest or most powerful support base without freaking them out and people are giving them money. Is it possible?
Yes, it is possible. I think you've got to take some risks, but I think the risks are worth taking. The first reason is just statistical. I mean, it's obvious that the vast majority of voters are black African. It's a no-brainer that that's what you go after, just from a business point of view, right? So that's where you start. But there's a couple of qualifiers here, but now I'm hypothesizing. There's an assumption that white South Africans cannot understand and are disinterested in conversations about social justice and about redress and race-based redress. And I'd love to test that, actually. I mean, some white people may be turned off by the idea that race-based affirmative action programs are inherently wrong. But people who say that every white person who votes DA will automatically either not vote or vote Freedom Front, if you give them a coherent story of how a well-run, not a cronyism version, but a well-run BEE policy, for example, is instituted by the state in a limited time and effectively. I don't buy that, because I think there's an assumption that every white voter is unprogressive in that fear that you will turn off white voters if the DA had to have an explicit, sincere buy-in into race-based redress policies. So I wouldn't accept that premise. But let's say worst case scenario, every single white voter would become nervous if the DA were to buy into explicit race-based affirmative action. If I was in the DA, as a DA member and strategist on the inside, I would still say, let's go for it. It just makes number sense. And besides making number sense, it makes complete and utter sense from a justice point of view. So you've got philosophical justification and you've got strategic justification.
In the book, if you haven't read it, Eusebius goes into Ubuntu, and then that being sort of contrary to liberalism, which is like we're all equal, but Ubuntu is sort of an Africanist sort of idea. But there is a lot of, like the idea of Nelson Mandela suddenly a DA guy. They really appropriated his concept, and then the Rainbow Nation rhetoric. So what I kind of need to phrase this. How would they go about changing the sort of ahistorical idea of a rainbow nation that they seem to?
Okay, there's a couple of questions in there, Conrad. Let me start with the first.
Sorry.
The chapter in the book that's probably the least important in terms of determining anyone's vote is chapter 1. It's a bit of a parochial discussion in some ways. And I was excited about this book event in part because I assume that for this audience, that chapter might be interesting. So I'm glad that you've asked that question. I'm going to take the liberty of responding fully. Chapter 1 is a discussion about, is the DA liberal? What does liberalism mean? And can liberalism accommodate values like Ubuntu? Now, a guy who's sitting in Alex or Soweto is not going to think about that on the 7th of May. In that sense, that chapter is not important in helping a confused voter. Okay, so I acknowledge that up front. But I think for people who really, really care about liberalism, or people who really, really care about the DA, that is probably a question, if you're a DA hack, that will really interest you. And one of the things that I think is unfortunate, Jan Jobert's response to that, although I quoted him without his permission, and in the review from Michael, is that people have focused on my psychologizing of Gareth van Onselen instead of focusing on my substantive comments about liberalism in chapter 1. Because what I did in chapter 1 of the book is I looked at an interesting, in my opinion, public debate between Gareth van Onselen, even though he's no longer inside the party. It doesn't matter. It's a device I use to open up a debate that doesn't take place sufficiently clearly in the party. That should. Because it's interesting, it goes to the heart of the identity of the party. Is the party liberal, and what does that mean? And it was a debate between Gareth and Musi Maimane about whether Ubuntu is compatible with liberalism. And essentially, Gareth argued that that is not the case. And the context of this was, of course, when Lindiwe Mazibuko had asked the president to retract his remarks that people and companies who support the ANC will be rewarded. And then, in typical fashion, Jackson Tembo had told her that she's speaking out of turn, that basically she doesn't understand Ubuntu and African values, that the president was just trying to suggest that good things will happen to you if you donate money. Cut a long story short, he thought, Musi that is, that he was coming to her rescue by then saying to the ANC, come on, this is absolute rubbish. A true African is someone who embraces Ubuntu, someone like Lindiwe. Lo and behold, you would have thought the biggest attack would come from the ANC, and it came from Gareth van Onselen, a fellow liberal on paper, who then said to Musi that he was being completely and utterly illiberal, that he's prescribing to Lindiwe what values to have, and that the party should be really scared of people who are threatening the liberal core and its identity. Now, you're going to have to read the chapter, I'm afraid, but the claim that I make, and I can't give you the full argument here in the interest of time, is that there are different strands of liberalism. There isn't an intellectual tradition in the DA currently, that the predecessors of the DA contained more liberals. I'm actually going beyond the chapter at the moment. And in many ways, frankly, the ANC and the tripartite alliance, in virtue of its size, not only has got more crooks than the DA has, they also have more thinkers. There are more ANC intellectuals I can put on the stage who will make it difficult for me to engage them academically like your fellow Jordans, then I can think of DA intellectuals. Now, the consequence of that is that Musi was left hanging. No one could come to his rescue. Eventually, the communications head wrote something, but it was an ad hominem attack against Gareth, not an intellectual defense of why Gareth was wrong. And what I do is I basically argue that there are many strands of liberalism. The one that is fit for a country, and it brings you to your historical point, with our historical injustices, is a strand of liberalism that we call in political theory liberal egalitarianism, that says a true liberal champions substantive equality, which is in our constitution anyway. And substantive equality is important in the name of liberalism. And what that means in practical terms is that the state can play an interventionist role where it provides certain goods like welfare, like the current state, not because the state is communist, but in fact because if you are a liberal, you value autonomy and you value the ability of individuals to flourish. But an individual can't flourish if you don't provide them with certain basic goodies that enable them to make choices that allow their autonomy to actually shine through. So there is a liberal justification for a welfare state if you are a liberal egalitarian. Someone like Gareth van Onselen, upon closer inspection, turns out to be closer to libertarianism. He's more Robert Nozick in political theory terms than he is John Stuart Mill. Now, unfortunately, no one in the DA could come to Musi's rescue. So the reality is, Conrad, that the DA doesn't have to be ahistorical. All those old farts who are no longer in the DA writing letters to the business day, there are easy responses to them, which is, hang on, we are not being pragmatic. I'm pretending now to be a DA strategist. We are not being pragmatic in growing the party and getting more black people to vote for us. We are being liberal egalitarian. We are, in fact, embracing values like Ubuntu, because true liberal egalitarians understand pluralism, understand the rights of individuals to choose their own values, embrace welfare, because enabling conditions allow autonomous individuals to choose their own lives. And you, Tony, you, Ken, you, Gareth, you, the whole institution of the South African Institute of Race Relations, are secretly illiberal and at worst libertarian, not liberal.
Okay, I have one last question. On Twitter, just to ask China's on Twitter, give me questions for Eusebius, don't tag him, and some guy goes, and they tags him. Why? What a doers. Yeah. But some guy called King Biela came with a brilliant answer, is at King Biela, he says, has he accepted Jacob Zuma as his Lord and Savior?
It's a process, not an event.
Thank you very much to Chester and to Conrad here, and of course to Eusebius. We're going to open up for questions for a few minutes. So this is where you get to put up your hand. There you go. I'm going to try and scoot around with the mic. So bear with me. Just pass it back, please.
Good evening, Eusebius.
Hello.
So my question to you, just in terms of the last part of the conversation, is how much do you think the DA's policies or rhetoric is, or sort of language, is just the ANC policies stripped of their left-leaning notions? So in many of my interactions in Parliament and my experience so far, is that I just feel the DA is just honest about their position on taxation, about redistribution. Whereas with the ANC, it's very much a Patrick Bond, kind of talking left, walking right.
Togo, that's a difficult and chachrak question that I can't answer in a pithy manner. So I mean, Yeah, I'll attempt to give you an answer, but it's not going to be satisfying because I think it requires much longer discussion. But that's me being completely honest. Here's the truncated view. The longer view we'll talk about over wine and beer, etc. I do think that there is very little ideologically and in terms of policy that separates the DA and the ANC. I definitely hold that view. The question is, who is that less flattering for, the ANC or the DA? For me, the answer is actually, it's not particularly flattering for the ANC, because the ANC masquerades as a very pro-poor party that is a broad church, but in reality, it is actually a party which, if you are a selfish voter and you are a businessman or middle class, you should be comforted by the ANC's macroeconomic policy and not be distracted by the fact that it is a gigantic welfare state. Notwithstanding that, I think the ANC is actually incredibly centrist and neoliberal in its thinking. Which is why, despite the nodding of the gentleman in front of you, it is so easy for the EFF to distinguish itself in identity terms. It is easy precisely because it is very difficult for the voter to distinguish the DA from the ANC. I do think there are differences in some of the detail. So for example, I would imagine under a DA government, there would be a massive reform of how the welfare budget is spent, the size of it, and also the way in which it works. I suspect the DA would be much more willing to, and I'm not sure if I'm uncomfortable with this. I think it would make some people hugely uncomfortable. Actually, I would have to think about it as a black person with many poor members of my family. But I think the DA would be able, for example, to think a little bit more about some of the South American countries' experimentation with conditionality, and not just literally handing resources over to poor people that don't necessarily enable them to become independent. So there may be some differences in some of the details that you can point to. But I think it's very difficult for the ordinary voter to list clear differences, which is why my book only contains one policy discussion. Because in reality, if you move away from the lecture seminar to what goes on in the head when you're in the queue on May the 7th, that's why I'm saying to you, the real drivers of preferences are those supposedly ethereal things like the symbolism of communications and tonality.
I'd like to know why those of us who can no longer vote for the ANC can't find a home or a party which would draw true liberals away from the DA. Why do you need the DA?
We don't need the DA. The problem is that all of the other parties that are alternatives to the DA have not been particularly good at taking the opportunity to distinguish themselves as viable alternatives to the DA. So for example, one of the biggest puzzles for me is why no party has been successful in growing itself on the basis of black consciousness ideology. I mean, if you listen to a lot of the things that I've been saying, a lot of people will say I'm race obsessed. I'm obsessed with the psychology of black people, of my own psychology. Even though, despite my education, being well-traveled, or being a high-income earner, I can afford to de-emphasize race and psychology if I wanted to. But I don't, because it is sincerely my lived reality on a daily basis. So there's a place in the political market, for example, for a party based on black consciousness. I also think that the DA, incidentally, which I don't talk about in the book, is filled with a lot of people who are not particularly liberal. And one of them, for example, is Helen Zille. I don't think she is a liberal. A couple of the most senior leaders in the DA told me off the record that she in fact has asked some of them to stop describing the party as liberal. That she's very uncomfortable with sex workers around Cape Town. She is not very clear on what she thinks in reality about us Moffies. And so I'm not even sure whether the leader up front is a classic liberal in the mold of John Stuart Mill. So when I ask in chapter 1, is liberalism compatible with Ubuntu? One of my friends correctly point out that I'm putting the cart before the horse. I'm assuming that there's a critical mass of liberals in the party. So I'm not even sure that there is a liberal party. Would a liberal party, for example, give its MPs a free vote on the Civil Unions Bill? On that particular day, the ANC was more liberal by saying that the thick principles, as we would say in philosophy, the thick principles of liberalism are more important than your illiberal conscience. We have a strict whip. So it's not even clear that there are many liberals in the DA. I think many of what I would consider to be classic liberal views on questions around drugs, abortion, homosexuality. I think you will find many DA MPs, black and white, who secretly cringe at some of the views that I hold, that are your key testers of whether you really are committed to liberalism. So there is no home for genuine liberals in South Africa.
I'm going to take one or two more questions. I just humor me for a sec. I'm curious about something, which is only sort of, well, it's very related to what Eusebius is talking about.
Just a point of order. I think Conrad disincentivized the DOP system inappropriately.
Yes, Conrad, speaker. I just want to see if you don't mind humouring me here. I just want to see a sort of straw poll. If people can put their hands in the air, if they are 90% sure, or 95% sure, or 100% sure of who they're going to vote for on May 7th, or whenever it is. How many people are sure?
Great, everyone else must buy my book. Thanks for your patience, by the way. We'll take one or two more questions. Sorry? Yes, I do have water here. Water is in... I've got to use Jimmy money language and over-concentration of bottles of water here.
You've expanded on a lot of points which I think are relevant to my question, but because you think one of the problems with liberalism in South Africa is that it's been associated with people who call themselves liberals, particularly I would say the Progressive Federal Party, who took a decidedly illiberal position by supporting something called qualified franchise. And that historically the only place for liberals has been if you support universal rights, despite it being a national party, despite it being an essential policy of liberalism, has been in the ANC if you support universal franchise after the Liberal Party destroyed itself.
Thanks for that question, Ben. Absolutely. I get pissed off at some of the confusions around liberalism. I think it goes for a lot of political terms, and I devote a couple of pages of discussion to it in chapter 1 of the book, which is to ask, is it best to just chuck out the word, given that it causes a lot of confusion? People mean different things by it. And I guess partly because of my analytic philosophy background, I am optimistic that it's possible to get to a precise definition as long as people at the outset of a conversation say what they mean, at least for purposes of a conversation around that discussion. Then you can get on with the discussion about what it is that you're talking about when you say liberalism in that particular context. Because you can take any word, whether it be socialism, progressive, which I think is a worse word to use because it's inherently good in terms of connotations. Who wouldn't want to be progressive, you know? So that's a worse recommendation as an alternative. But basically, I agree with you. I think one of the problems with liberalism is that it is conflated with the history of the DA and its predecessors. When I call myself liberal, for example, all I mean, and my friends in the room, I mean, this is not news to any of my friends, but they know that all I mean by liberalism is on liberty, actually. I mean, it's actually even that precise. I mean the gospel according to John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty. I think it's the ultimate blueprint for what the moral limits are on the state's power over the individual. And so, in the South African context, I think there are many of my friends who are ANC members who are SACP members who are actually liberal in my definition. But when I call them liberal, they get hugely pissed off because they think what I'm saying is, you are a DA member. So it's so confused that people think liberal means white. They think liberal means DA. And when I told some of my friends, like Francis Antoni, who's a very close friend of mine at the Helen Suzman Foundation, that I've got a whole chapter on liberalism, he proceeded to send me a bibliography of all the people I've never heard of from the history of the parties that preceded the DA. My book is not an exegesis of the DA and people who've preceded it and what Helen Suzman said on liberalism, precisely because conceptually, as a student of philosophy, I think there's a substantive idea of liberalism that is not specific to the history of how it may or may have played out in the history of South African political parties. I couldn't give a damn what Helen Suzman said about liberalism. Why do I need to know what she said about it? I'm a liberal in the sense in which I mean, and I define it in a pithy sense. And in my sense, it is actually not a swear word. And many people who think they're not liberal are liberal in the sense in which I mean it, which is basically that the individual is best placed to make decisions about what kind of life they want to live, to have as many choices as possible, and that the state should only restrict your freedom insofar as doing so is necessary to prevent harm to other people, and that the burden of proof, at the risk of stirring memories of the Oscar trial, the burden of proof is always on the state to justify the limitations on the freedom. That's all I mean by it. In that basic sense, many people are liberal who are not members of the DA, and the DA doesn't have a monopoly on a discussion of liberalism.
We'll take one last question, because we are out of time. At the back there.
To move the discussion a bit away from liberalism. So of late, the Democratic Alliance has been making a lot of claims for publicity's sake. For example, the 6 million real job march, take away e-tolls, etc., etc. Do you think, for campaigning's sake, for now and in future, they'll be leading towards being a populist party for campaigning sake?
Look, I think that's actually a great question. I'd have to think about it some more before I give you a considered view. I don't have a considered view on that. I think that's a very good question. I think the DA, in part, in the BE mess, from a campaigning point of view, was caught in that dilemma. The dilemma of, is there a quick win? To go back to Togo's question, to speak the rhetoric that the masses might like, even if secretly I don't like it. And then they were exposed. Because what actually happened the day before was Wilmot James didn't like the idea of BEE, which is why after 10 minutes into a discussion on Power Talk with me, he could no longer keep the fort, because his honesty came through. So it has been a tactical dilemma for them. Whether the 6 million jobs is an instance of that, I'm not quite sure. What I would say counts in their favor a little bit is that the ANC is very lazy. The ANC doesn't take the DA seriously enough, and they really should. Not because opposition inherently deserves respect, but given that the ANC itself is facing a moral crisis, of course it's going to still get a large majority. But it's declining, and the rate at which it declines is important in terms of what will happen in 2019. They ought to start doing to the DA what the DA is doing towards itself, which is to pressure test the feasibility of its claims and its track record where it governs, and no one in the ANC is doing that kind of homework and asking your kind of question. And if they did, I think the DA would have even greater difficulty in deciding about these kind of tactics.
Thank you, Eusebius.